And welcome to everybody who is joining us on a recorded session as opposed to the live one. Good to see you. We are getting toward the end of the first quarter, which for some of you will be a relief, and for others probably adds a little pressure to get some more stuff done. But I'm sure if you keep working hard, everybody's going to be okay. Don't hesitate to reach out to your teachers, me included, if there's something that we can help you with. We certainly want to limit the frustration as much as we can at this point of the year, because we've all been there too, and we do understand. So just a couple of quick notes here, housekeeping sort of stuff for the class. For some people who are struggling in the class, you may have received an email from me that indicates the assignments that we have in the course and the ones that I would consider the most important, the ones that are most heavily weighted toward the final grade. So if you received an email from me, I CC'd it to parents and guardians, and all it really contained was another encouragement to keep working hard and keep trying to submit and improve your assignments, as well as a list of those assignments for the class that I felt are probably the most important in order to demonstrate your understanding of the various events and their historical relevance and application to today. The most important stuff to make sure that everybody meets their goals for the course. So that was one thing that went out today. If you did not receive an email, or your parents and guardians did not receive an email, then you don't need to worry about it. It just means you're passing the class and doing fine. And I guess the second thing I wanted to mention is I apologize for the Canva for the review assignment from 1 to 5. It had worked at one point, which is why it was up there. And then I had a student email me and say, it's just not working. It's treating it like a non-editable PDF. And sure enough, Canva changed something along the lines, and that document became basically confusing and unusable, which is really unfortunate. So I'm going to have to find some way to rejig that assignment so it works in a different format. I'll probably just take it and put it into a PowerPoint template that people can download. It'll be a little easier to use. That being said, I don't want to add to any stress at the end of the quarter here. So I think I'm just going to nix that assignment from the class, as it was mostly review, which means that you've already demonstrated a lot of those outcomes to me. It was just another opportunity to sort of demonstrate improved understanding along those lines. So it wasn't really what I would consider a critical assignment anyway. But I also indicated in the email I sent out about that, in the announcement, that some people had actually finished it in a different format and submitted it, and some people were sort of halfway through it. And I told those students just to email me, and we'll make sure that we work something out so that you do get credit for anything that you did demonstrate, any learning you did demonstrate in that assignment, whether you got the whole thing done or just a little piece of it done or whatnot. So if you have, in short, if you haven't started that assignment, review assignment 1 to 5, don't worry about it. It's no longer up there. I don't think it's visible anymore, so you shouldn't run into it. I'm just going to take it out of the course. And if you have either completed it in a different format or you had part of it done, just send me an email and we'll work out some way to make sure you get credit for the work that you did. Which means we're moving into Unit 6, and some people have already submitted some assignments in Unit 6. And I just wanted to use today as an opportunity to go through the significant amount of readings, I guess, compared to other units in this particular unit, and just go over, a bit of the processes as to how I isolate what I think is important when I'm either taking a class or trying to learn something new outside of a traditional academic environment, and just show you the things that I've highlighted in this particular document that we're using to get started in the industrial era, and show you the reason I highlighted things and why they're significant to the time period, and not just to that time period but to the progression and where we are today and where we might go in the future, because that's a real goal for all of our studies in history, is not just the fact that an event happened, but more so an understanding of human nature and politics and the economic and social and political factors that led to where we are today, and the things that we need to learn from history in order to progress in a responsible manner as citizens. And it seems over time that we learn some lessons and we don't learn other lessons, no matter how many times we make the same mistake. And if your generation's coming up, you're going to be replacing my generation. You're going to have the power in all of these institutions. You're going to have political power. You're going to have economic power. You're going to have social power. and your ability to wield that power responsibly and effectively is in some part contingent to the history that your family, your society, your nation has in its wake, and what you are willing to or interested in taking from those events and what's happened and the views and the way that views have evolved over the years, and taking it forward so that your generation can do the best with your time that you can, and the best with your power. I guess it's the Spider-Man model. You're going to have great power. It may not feel like it right now, but you're going to have great power, both as an individual and as a collective. And with that power comes responsibility. We have seen through examples in both ancient and recent history that power, political, economic, social, can very easily be used to harm people as opposed to help people, to harm societies instead of help people. So I think it's part of your responsibility as a citizen and as a future leader to take what you can and use the information that is available to you, and use your experience to form your worldview, and to try to work cooperatively with others to ensure that society moves in the direction that your generation feels is most important or most beneficial. Okay, so without further ado, I'm gonna open it up just for a second here. Are there any kind of housekeeping items that anybody has any questions with? If it's specific to an assignment or a question on an assignment, that's more what I'd like to deal with on our Friday sessions. But that doesn't mean you can't email me before that, and I can't set up some time to either get your response by email or set up a one-on-one or something like that. But in general, today's session, I kind of want to focus on the content at hand. That being said, do you have any questions about past assignments, future assignments, anything sort of the housekeeping or structure of the course or anything like that? Because this would be a good time for me to address it. All right, not seeing or hearing anything, so I'll carry on. As always, if there's something that I'm going through with today's sort of current content that isn't making sense, or you'd like maybe a different explanation or a little bit more elaboration or some examples, just type something in the chat box or turn on your mic. Let me know. I'm always happy to stop and go back or re-explain, do whatever we need to do to make sure that you feel like you're comfortable with the concepts and the events. So again, don't hesitate. If you've got a question, chances are somebody else has the same question. So never hesitate. There's no stupid questions. All right, so Unit 6. We've moved from Middle Ages into a Renaissance period in Europe. I mean, remember, we've also been focusing on a sort of a Western European perspective of history in this class. And you will certainly expand that experience in your future humanities courses. It won't be as focused on, say, Europe. But in this particular course, it kind of sets the stage for some of these concepts using Europe and parts of Africa and North America with regard to colonialization to lay the groundwork for those concepts. We started with the Middle Ages and sort of dark to Middle Ages in discussing feudalism and feudalist structure and the notions of power and politics at the time. And then we made we sort of took that into a revolutionary era, a Renaissance era, where we were talking about how views from ancient Greeks kind of made a comeback, and focus was shifted a lot more toward education and expression with regard to art and architecture and community, and the three fundamental ideals of the Renaissance era: truth, beauty, and wisdom. Then from there, we took it to more of a colonial, imperialist, and commerce-based perspective, where we're talking about the advances in technology finally making it so that nations can explore outside of their traditional geographic boundaries, and that opens up all sorts of opportunities for good things like exchange of ideas and trade and connecting with people that have different viewpoints, different cultures. But on the negative side, it also opened up the door for a lot of exploitive behaviors by nations, particularly in in Europe, in Western Europe, where now they had the ability to use naval dominance and the power of technology to subjugate other nations and exploit them for their resources, for their people, for their wealth, to get richer. So, you know, the age of commerce, the size of your nation and its relative location now had less influence on how much power you had as a nation, because if you didn't have certain resources, if you didn't have a whole lot of land, there were ways now in the imperialist era where you could access and exploit other lands. So that was a significant shift in society, starting in the, say, 1400s and moving through the colonial era, some of which hangs on to today as we watched a video about France and how it still, you know, does operate partially as a colonial nation. They still have holdings in Southern America. They have holdings in other places as well that they continue to use as a source of resources, as a source of places to conduct research, testing, and just to have another body of people that are essentially still considered French citizens. So a colonial era, though its peak would have been in the 1700s, there's still holdovers of actual colonial holding today. And as we well know, in our nation, the effects of the colonizing nations are felt to this day, and unfortunately, as often in a negative manner, because of the exploitation and the subjugation, as a positive manner of anything positive that could have come out of it. Now, that's not to say that everything during the colonial era was necessarily bad for a home nation, but it certainly there were many really horrific things to come from it, along with those benefits, and something that we really need to be, you know, aware of and recognize, and it's one of those things that we need to take forward, both, you know, all of us, really our generation, my generation, your generation, to make sure that that sort of stuff doesn't happen again, and you know, make sure people are cared for, and that there's more of a collective and communal, if not communal, at least there's a respect and a connection between different distinct cultures, so that the spirit of cooperation is more of a focus than the spirit of colonizing or grouping everybody together or treating everybody the same. I believe the notion of equity versus equality is becoming more and more important in society, and it's being given its due. And I don't think it used to for a long time. Even in the recent history, which I would consider maybe the last 50 years, there was a lot of focus in the era prior to that and during that era that equality was the important thing, equal rights, equal this, equal that, which was a good first step for a lot of minority, for a lot of people in marginalized or minority groups. But at the same time, we've kind of advanced our understanding now to realize that not everybody starts at the same point. Not everybody has been given the opportunity to start start or progress at the same rate. So giving everybody equal access to everything, more often than not, can actually lead to bigger gaps between the haves and the have-nots. So a more a different approach, more in equity, and considering individual circumstances for not just people, but for entire groups of people and marginalized societies and groups, is probably a better way to get people to a point where we can more effectively balance resources and happiness and general, you know, productivity and the good things that we want in society. So I think that's a good movement, and I think it's an important one. So we've gone through the age of commerce and the age of Renaissance, age of commerce, and then we kind of shifted gears a bit, and we came overseas and from Europe and back into North America, and discussed Iroquoian culture, get a bit of an indigenous perspective. And remember, I told you to kind of disregard the land boundaries. You know, where does Canada start, the U.S. start, where are the states, where are the provinces, and think of this more as the time before colonialization. And you know, the land wasn't separated out and delineated the way that it is now, and more about the leadership structure and the perspective of the Iroquoian, the members of the Iroquoian Confederacy, and how their approach has some similarities, but also some significant contrasts to the approach toward leadership and literature and recording of historical events. There's a lot of things in there that we kind of approached similarly on different sides of the ocean, but there were probably more pronounced differences or contrasts that we pointed out as we went through the Unit 5 materials. And now, so we've gone from essentially the 1200s to the 1500s to the 1700s into probably a bit of the 1800s, and then we went and we talked about groups of people in North America that have been around for what we would consider time immemorial, basically before we can remember it. So thousands and thousands of years. And now we're going to shift gears again, shift time periods again, and we're going to take ourselves into Europe, primarily Western Europe, starting in Great Britain, in let's call it back into the 1750s. So we're into the colonial era. We're full on the colonial era, and we're going to discuss some very, very significant changes in the way that we basically produce and manufacture, and the impacts that those changes had on people. So that's where we're going. And I know we're kind of bouncing around in time periods, so I just wanted to kind of recenter us a little bit. As now we're back in the 1700s, and we're going to talk less about the colonialism or the imperialism slash discovery slash exploration, however you want to term it, era, and more talk about what was going on in the home nations with regard to technology and production and how that was changing the world. So it's really closely related to the to the colonial era, because all this was happening during the colonial era. It's also very, very closely related to the to Unit 4, the commerce era, because this is really all about the economy and money and the effect that it had on society. So it's very, very closely related to Units 3 and 4, and probably not such, not so well matched with what we just discussed in Unit 5. But I just wanted, we wanted to break the content up a little bit to certainly get some different perspectives and maybe give our brains a break from Europe for a unit. But we're going back. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution here, which was a very, very significant, very, very important period of time for the world in general. And what it essentially was is the feudal days were over, Renaissance is past, and the urbanization of Western Europe is occurring, which means people are moving from the country into the cities. And because we discussed in the units about both commerce and to some extent in the colonial unit, that the feudal structure was gone. So a lot of peasants and farmers and people in the lower classes of society who used to make their living off of the land, and it was generally a subsistence living, meaning that they made just enough for them to survive and then to give some to the lords so that they were protected. With the advances in technology, people were able to farm more efficiently and to do more work and get more production with fewer people and with less person power. And what that meant was essentially there was a lot of unemployed people from lower classes who could no longer live in the country. Lords had stolen their land. Larger farming operations had replaced small plots kind of here and there inside these areas. And so there were a lot of people who were without homes, without ways of feeding themselves, a lot of unemployment. And these people gradually migrated to the cities that were popping up. The cities were popping up for a number of reasons that we discussed, and one of them was that trade was improving because people now had they now had the technology and the transportation means to go further than they ever had before, which means if you're going to new lands, you can likely trade goods, things that you have that they don't, and things that they have and you don't. And cities pop up along the way because you need routes, you need places along the routes you travel in order to get food and in order to feed and water the horses and stay for the night and be protected and whatnot. So towns were growing, in the say 14, 15, 1600s. And as the Industrial Revolution started to take form, that happened even more frequently because there were a lot of people from rural areas moving into these cities because they didn't have land anymore and they couldn't feed themselves. They were unemployed and they needed to survive. So they would come to cities and they would try to start trades or find work in cities in order to feed themselves and their family. And when this happened on a large scale, obviously the city populations go way up. And the Industrial Revolution and what came from it had a big part of that. So just going through here, these are the notes in that Canva, and I just highlighted things that I thought were really important for the unit. I did mention this in the last couple live sessions. I think a good approach to learning. I'm from an era where the teacher would largely just come up to the board and you'd copy notes down for like 45 minutes or something, and then you'd answer some questions, and that's a good for some things, but it was a lot of note taking. There is some evidence to suggest that if you take notes, actual written notes, it activates parts of your brain that aren't activated just by listening or just by watching. There is some science to suggest that it is beneficial, but I always want to caution you about picking out things that are important, because you can often get bogged down in details that aren't essential to the learnings in the class, the units, and not just this class, any class. So it's really an important skill, particularly if you are thinking about maybe university or some post-secondary education, that you develop your skills to take notes about the things that are important. And how do you know what's important if you're not, if you're not an expert in the subject, or if you haven't done it before? How do you know what's important? So how do you know what notes to take? In that case, my advice would always be go to the assignments first, go to the assessments, and have a quick read over as to what it is that we're asking, your teachers in general are asking you to demonstrate. And you likely won't know the answers because you haven't really gone through the content yet. But what it does is it sort of preloads your brain and activates and gives you an idea as to what it is that is important and what you should keep your eye open for, your eye and your mind open for. So when you go back and you watch the tutorial videos or you read the assignments or we do the live sessions, you will have some recollection, even if faint, that, oh, that was something that I think was in one of the assignments, or something that was noted as an important area of learning. And it just gives you a better idea as to what's important. What should I pick out? What should I highlight in case I need to go back and reference later? I think that's a lot more efficient. I think it's better for you as a student. And I think it's healthier for you because you can burn out pretty quickly if you're constantly just processing information, particularly in written form. It can be really easy to get bogged down in details and just exhaust yourself mentally. So that's a recommendation I'd like to mention again for each unit, and in other classes as well. It'll work better in certain classes than other, but it's a good idea to look at what you're being assessed on prior to going and doing the learning. Just because of this preloading process, you'll be in a better position to pick out the important stuff. So here's the important stuff, or what I thought was the important stuff regarding the Industrial Revolution. It's important to note that it's not official, because technology has been advancing all over the world for the entire history of the world. And we're going to focus on Europe, as we have been in this class, just to give us sort of a more narrow approach to learn about these concepts. But it's important to understand that technological improvement was happening everywhere. And just sort of a Westernist education, my generation wasn't really exposed all that much to technological advances in, say, Asia, Southeast Asia, in areas like that, because there were significant technological advantages. Probably, you could argue, probably more there than in the rest of the world combined, that we just typically didn't learn about. I don't know if it wasn't just deemed as relatable by history teachers of my generation, but it is important to note that this is not something that, these are not things that Britain invented necessarily. A lot of things were sort of co-invented around the world during similar time periods, but just because of the distances between them, it wasn't really realized that one invention over here could spread over there, or maybe two things were being developed at a similar time. They worked a little bit differently, but had the same kind of idea. It's important not to take a super narrow approach on this and figure that all the technology in the world and all the improvements started out in Britain and filtered out, because that's not true. But we're going to focus here because, if we do it globally, it's just kind of too big to wrap our heads around at this point. So we are focusing on Britain, and we are using Britain and Western Europe as an example, but it is not the only place that significant technological innovation was happening. Okay, so we're talking about Britain in the 1700s, probably more so to the middle of the 1700s. The big idea is major industrialization. So industry is essentially, we can think of it for now as products and services. So we are building, we are using technology, machines, factories, etc., to produce products, resources, refine things, and get them in a form that we can either sell them inside our country to the people or trade them to other countries for money or for other goods that we would like, that we, for survival, for enjoyment. The idea of industrialization, let's just think of it as sort of factories and products and services that we are going to produce as a nation. So major industrialization was sort of characterized by an improvement in the way that we do agriculture using machinery, and also at the same time, better ways to generate power. In the old days, power came from your arm, working in the fields, or it came from draft animals like horses and oxen. But with the invention of the steam engine and later internal combustion engines like a gas engine in a car, or hybrid power, diesel power, burning coal for energy, full-on, did I say electric power? Full-on electric power. These things didn't exist back then. So the jump from using horses and oxen and person power, the jump from that into the steam, the ability to generate power with essentially fire water, making steam and driving a turbine, was a very, very significant advancement in the way that we provided power for agriculture, for factories, but also for transportation. The ability to, for trains, to the invention of trains or ships that were powered by steam and paddles as opposed to just relying on the wind. So those were kind of the really big changes here is the machinery that we could use in order to travel and in order to produce goods. All right, and it really was a turning point in history. It really was. We talked a little bit, I talked a little bit about this earlier, in that with the revolutions, previously people were using a lot of hand tools and a lot of what we consider now primitive methods of farming and building goods and shipping goods and whatnot. And the sources of power that we're able to generate in this period made all that a lot easier, and that had several significant effects. So before the Industrial Revolution, again, some of this is kind of repeated information here. People tended to make all their own stuff, right? They made their own clothes. They made their own, they grew their own food. They probably didn't have much land, or if they didn't own any land, they used common land to grow enough food for a subsistence living. And they never traveled. If that was partly because they didn't have time to travel because they were working so hard to feed families, and also they just didn't have the means to travel. I mean, if you had a horse-drawn cart, you were actually probably reasonably wealthy in a feudal to post-feudal era. But basically, you could only go as far as your feet would take you without you falling down. And then when you were out there, you had to protect yourself, and you had to know that things were okay if you had a family. I mean, you couldn't just walk away and leave your family to fend for themselves. So people didn't travel. They stayed in their little villages or in their houses and within the feudal lands at the time. And the Industrial Revolution changed all that, right? The ability to travel made a significant difference, not just in where you were able to go, but also in the economic health of your nation, because you were able to not just bring yourself to new places, you were able to bring goods and opportunities to trade. So a lot of these rural ways of life were ending, and people were moving to cities. And farming and agriculture was still a huge deal, but instead of it being a bunch of small plots all worked by people, they were aggregating them, meaning they were bringing all the small areas of land and farmers' fields and whatnot. Instead of having 100 different families planting in each one, they would have large sections of land that were owned by whoever was in power of the region at the time, and they would farm it all as a sort of a collective group selected by the owner of the land to farm the fields, as opposed to everybody just kind of working at it and trying to take what they could get to feed their families and pass them up the line. So it was more efficient, but it was also a situation where a lot of people were now homeless and jobless and whatnot, and are moving to cities. So the way that people were doing things was ending, And with that, other things were taking their place, and the Industrial Revolution offered an opportunity for a lot of those rural people who were in danger of starving and not being able to feed or take care of their families. It opened up different opportunities, jobs, and ways to make a living that didn't exist before, and that's a good thing. Did one cause the other? Did the fact that people were unemployed and starving cause the Industrial Revolution because there was a need for it, or or was it something that's sprang up, sort of outside of that at the same time? I don't know. I mean, I think a reasonable argument could be made for either side, depending on your expertise in the area, but I won't weigh in on that. The point is, people needed work. People needed a different way other than farming a small plot of land in order to survive. And the Industrial Revolution and the technology that came with it and the economy that came with it, basically made a place for a lot of these people. Okay, so why did it start in the first place? We're going to start on the left side here. All right, we already talked about how steam power allowed better travel. Okay, so you didn't have to rely on the wind, or you didn't have to rely on animals. Basically, if you had coal or wood, and you could burn that in a furnace and heat up water so that it produced steam, and then the steam was used to basically drive a turbine or a propeller that allowed you to turn a big paddle for a boat or turn wheels for a train. You didn't have to rely on the wind anymore. As long as you had coal or wood, you could go for as long as you wanted. So people were able to travel. As well, all this was definitely later, probably 100 years later, things like the telegraph were invented, whereby people could actually send messages to faraway lands, even over oceans eventually, in order to communicate with people without actually having to be there face to face. And that was an idea that was absolutely, unheard of in the early 1700s. The idea that the King of France could get on the telegraph with the King of England without having to make a big journey for them to meet, that obviously makes the world a little smaller, and we've seen so many examples of that in our own life. I lived in essentially a pre-internet era when I was growing up, and frankly, the world was a little bigger. I had to go places to learn certain things. I didn't have access to information from across the ocean instantly. I would actually have to pick up a phone, or I would have to travel or do something. Whereas now, everything's so interconnected by the ability to get information between places and places anywhere in the world that, I just sort of term that, or people term that, the world's getting smaller. It's easy for you to access information and processes and get what you need from anywhere in the world, as opposed to having to either physically get there or translate things through the phone and whatnot. So we've seen this in our own lifetime, and the invention of the telegraph would have been every bit as mind-blowing and important to somebody in the mid 1800s as the concept of the internet would have been to me in the mid 1990s. So it was really important. Other things, interesting things, medically speaking. The note here that an American dentist used anesthetic for the first time. Is that necessarily a really important note for this unit? No, I just thought it was really interesting because I read stories about surgeries prior to anesthetic. Anesthetic, being like a drug that would essentially make you sleep, so that they could do a surgery while you were asleep, and you wouldn't feel any pain. You'd wake up and you'd be able to start recovering. They didn't always have that, so they used to do crazy things, like they just give you a bottle of whiskey and hope that you drank enough that you passed out and didn't wake up while they were amputating your leg, or hit you over the head with something to knock you unconscious so that they could amputate an arm or something like that. And dentistry, I mean, if you've ever had a cavity or some problem with your teeth, you know how intensely painful a really bad toothache or a bad root or something like that, it's absolutely incapacitating. Luckily enough, we live in an era where most of the time we can go to a dentist and they can fix it and make it stop hurting. In those days, they could go to a dentist, but they basically have to get anything that they could fixed without any freezing or any way to numb the pain. It would have been horrible. I've read accounts of sort of the Old West in the United States in the, you know, whatever, call it the 1830s to 1880s, where people would like literally knock their own teeth out or grab a, remove a piece of their jaw with a tooth attached to it just because the pain got so much they couldn't bear it. I know that's sort of gory sorry about that, but interesting nonetheless that people would go to that length because of the pain. So the idea that you could now be anesthetized or put to sleep while somebody did painful work on you to fix it was quite a big deal. In the old days, sorry, one more kind of tangent, but I thought it was interesting. A mortality rate is basically the percentage of people that would die during a period. Now, if we're talking about a surgery, the mortality rate for a surgery is either 0 or 100. If somebody dies, it's 100%. So basically, that person, the only person, died. And if the person survives, the mortality rate for that particular surgery is 0. You can apply it to more than one surgery. Let's say you did 10 operations in a day, and 6 of those patients lived, and 4 of those patients died. You could say the mortality rate was 40% because 4 out of 10 died. And you could also say the survivability rate was 60% because 6 out of 10 lived. I read about, why is this important to the story? But I read a story about a surgeon pre-anesthesia whose mortality rate for a single operation on a single person was 300%. And you're probably saying to yourself, how is that possible? There's only one person they're operating on. How could it be more than 100%? Either the person lives or the person dies. Well, here's how. Because the anesthetic that they used, if they had any at all, in this case, I don't think they did, because it wasn't a thing, they had to do surgeries, mostly things like amputation, like cutting off a limb. They had to do that extremely quickly as they could, and sew up the cauterize and sew up the blood vessels and things like that. So a patient wouldn't either A, die of shock, or B, get infection, or C, just die of blood loss. So they had a reason that they had to be really quick. And there was a surgeon, I can't remember his name, but there was a surgeon who was quite well renowned for being very, very, very quick. He could amputate a limb very quickly. He could either cauterize or close off the blood vessels and get the person cleaned up quicker than anybody else. But he also had a tendency to be kind of haphazard because he was moving so quickly. Well, in one surgery, he was I can't remember what he was amputating. Let's just say, for instance, it was the leg. But he was moving so quickly that he actually injured the person that was helping him, the assistant. And that person got an infection and got sepsis, so a really bad infection, and ended up dying later. Well, the patient also died during the surgery, and somebody that saw the doctor, I think he cut off his fingers or something like that, cut off the assistant's fingers by accident, died of shock. So one operation, the patient died, the assistant died, and somebody watching died. So that was a 300% mortality rate, and that was, so there's your doctor in the 1700s. A little different than it is today. So I don't know if you found that interesting or not, but I did. Okay, so things like that, right? We're anesthetic, advances in medicine, antibiotics is a big one. So people, when they're getting sick with things that are biologically based, if they've got germs and whatnot causing significant illness, people didn't have to die from that anymore. Antibiotics could make a person better. Advances in the way that people ate made them healthier in general. They were more resistant to disease because they were getting fed enough. And we're talking generally, people still starve, but just in the general sort of scheme of the lower middle classes, people were generally healthier, which means mothers were healthier, which means babies tended to live past infant. They tended to live past their the sort of baby years. One thing to keep in mind is when we're talking about life expectancy, you can look back and you can read that the life expectancy in the Middle Ages was about 35 years. So if you lived to 36, you lived longer than the average person, and it's traditionally gone up as nations have gotten better with the medicine, better with nutrition, better with surgery, things like that. It's important to note that it's not that you were old in the 1200s. If you were 35, it's not that you were old and gray and stooped over and whatnot. Your life was harder physically for certain because of the hard physical labor you had to do. But I don't want you getting the idea that because the average life expectancy was in the 30s, that if you made it to 35, you were this old, great, old and gray, using your cane, hobbling down the street. It wasn't really like that. People still, if they were healthy enough when they were younger, they still tended to live into their 50s, 60s, sometimes 70s and beyond. The reason the average age or the life expectancy was so low is because oftentimes they factored in infant mortality into those figures, which means because so many babies died because mothers were not generally healthy and medical care for infants and whatnot was not very good and people just didn't have access to it, a lot of babies died. And this is often why families had, so many children in eras past. They had to have a lot of children to work farms, to help provide for families. It's not like they had a whole bunch of children and they all just kind of moved away. Families tended to stay relatively close together, and because they needed people to help, the collective survive for that family. But there also came a point where, because infants weren't dying with the same regularity that they did in earlier times, because you lived past infant past your infant years into young adult and into adult and old age, families got bigger just because more people were living. So when you look at sort of the average life expectancy of people from times past, it's not exactly what it might appear to be on the surface. Largely, the average age of a man or a woman in a certain era has a lot to do with people dying when they were babies, and then also people dying of things that they didn't die of anymore. Sorry, I've been ignoring the comments, but now I'm going back to that. The doctors were scarier than the diseases back then. Yeah, definitely, George. You did not want to go see the doctor or the dentist back then. If you did, you were already in trouble, and you were probably bound to be in more trouble. And yes, Amelia, it is definitely terrifying. And no, George, they had no concept. Let's call it prior to the 1700s. They really didn't have any concept of germs and infection and why people got sick after they would have an amputation or something like that, or why they got a cut and somebody would die. They didn't really understand why that was happening. And you'll probably hear stories about doctors using leeches to suck out the bad blood and things like that. They didn't really know how to make people better, so they came up with a lot of really weird, wacky, mythical ideas, most of which did more harm than good, but because they didn't understand the science behind it at that point. And that really did start changing in the late 17th, early 18th century, where they started discovering, they had better microscopes and things like that, so they had a better understanding of the structure of cells and the structures of bacteria and viruses and things like that. And so things tended to get a little better as they discovered these tiny little bugs, quote, that were causing all these problems with infection and disease and whatnot. It was the beginning of being able to solve a lot of those problems that were killing people, not just when they were babies, but into their young adult years and so forth. So average life expectancy going up, mostly because people can live a little longer because we can take care of a lot of diseases that we couldn't take care of before, and also the average age of people is going up because we're not losing so many infants, which was if I don't know what the exact rates are, to be honest with you, but I suspect if you had 10 children and 3 of them lived to adulthood in the 1400s, and you were in like a lower class level, obviously the nobles had better success, but if you had 3 out of 10 children live past infancy in those era, in the pre-1700 era, you were probably doing pretty well. Whereas today, obviously, that you would expect that 95+% of the babies born would survive into through their infant years. Okay, so a little bit of digression there. We'll come back over some of that content in a bit, but big advances in medicine making a big deal. So there's more people, right? There's more people around. Populations are going up because people aren't dying as often. Now, let's go specifically to agriculture for a bit here. In the old days, let's just go back to the Middle Ages, because that's essentially where we started the course and period of time. Farmers would plant the same crops in the same field over and over and over again, partially because they felt they had to, because they just barely had enough to eat in the first place, but also because they didn't really know anything about soil nutrients and how to make soil fertile so they could grow stuff. So they found out probably just through trial and error like anything else, that if they left a field fallow, meaning they didn't plant anything on it for that year, that the crop they would get the year after that would be better. So they did figure out that if I have 3 fields and I plant my one crop on those 3 fields and I leave my 4th field fallow, it's called, just not planting anything there, then the next year I have another field that's fallow and I plant the one that was fallow before. And they would notice that that what they were growing on that field that had been left for a year, they got much better yields out of. So they figured out that you should rotate your crops a little bit so that you could let the soil sort of rejuvenate and let the minerals and the things that crops need to grow build up again, because you were just constantly, if you're constantly buying the same thing in the same plot all the time, it's just sucking nutrients out and never replenishing them. And sooner or later, your crops just die and you get droughts and things like that. So they had that kind of figured out, but now they were figuring out that not every plant is equal. And if you plant different things, some plants can help repair the soil for other plants. So for instance, if you were growing wheat, you would also maybe plant some clover or turnips or something like that, which is also, turnips something you could eat. So it was something you were getting out of the ground that could actually feed you. But at the same time, the process of growing, like the ecological process for growing turnips, would actually help replenish the soil for the wheat. So you were not only getting food, you were actually also preparing the field for next year or 2 years from now when you were going to put wheat back there. So they were figuring out these things that could make your ability to get to harvest the land and the amount that you would get from your harvest was increasing very, very significantly, partially because of the understanding of this crop rotation idea and planting different types of crops, but as much so, probably more so, with the technology that came along with how they were planting and how they were harvesting the crop with machinery. That was a really, really big deal. Back in the old days, again, we're going back to the 1300s, maybe before, well, certainly before, you're planting a field. People would go out with handfuls of seeds and just toss them and hope it grew, right? You'd till the land a bit and get it so that the seeds would actually penetrate the ground and not just sit on the surface and dry out. But they just, they'd throw seeds from a sack and it grew where it grew. Well, with all this new machinery and the ability to make things out of iron and make things that are mechanical, with the science and the technology there, now things like the seed drill are being invented. Seed drill, instead of just throwing seed randomly out here and there, it was a drill that would plant them in a straight line, and it would actually drive down into the soil to make sure that the stuff that didn't actually hit a furrow didn't just rot and dry out on the ground. This would drive all the seed in a straight line so that your crops grew in lines now, and they were tended to be healthier because all of the seeds were driven into the proper level of the soil. So it reduced the amount of seed it needed because you were just throwing out handfuls before, and it improved the ability or improved the efficiency of harvesting, because instead of having your plants all over the place, they were in nice straight rows. And also the plants tended to be healthier because they were driven to the right depth in the ground by the seed drill. So that's an example of how technology significantly improved how farming was done, right? Also, absolutely, George, a healthy distance between the plants. If you have plants that are too close to each other, they're going to be robbing sun and robbing moisture and robbing nutrients from each other and sort of cannibalizing each other. So instead of potentially 2 healthy plants at a proper distance, you might have 2 completely unhealthy plants, or 1 plant that's healthy and 1 plant that died. So all good, really, with regard to being more efficient, getting more of a harvest out of your fields. This technology was essential. And the same thing, not just for seeding, right? For plowing the fields, there were new mechanical iron plows instead of having to do it by hand with hand tools or with a horse and some sort of wooden contraption that would probably break or wear down or rot or degrade. Being able to have iron and tools that were hardy and also easy to drive with animals or sometimes with steam power made it a lot easier to plow the land and to A, do a better job of it, B, do it with much less person power or animal power, and C, do it and see be able to repeat it year after year because the equipment was finally at a point where it was strong enough to withstand constant abuse. So all of these things are contributing to a lot more food being taken from the land more efficiently. So, you know, you've got more to feed, you've got more to sell, and you can support more people. You know, a nation runs on its stomach, an army marches on its stomach is a famous saying, but the same thing's true with nation. Your nation can only be as big as your ability to feed it. So as the ability to improve your yields for crops increases, your ability to support a population of people increases, and that happened. Populations really exploded during the time. The enclosure movement, I kind of talked about a little bit already. It's more or less just the idea that instead of having all these little plots of fields or common land that the peasants were allowed to farm on, as farming becomes more of a profitable enterprise, more a better money maker, okay, because a lot of the surplus food was traded. As it became a better money maker, the wealthy lords of the land started enclosing their lands and drawing lines on maps and actually putting up fences to keep people out, which didn't happen much before. The castle and the kingdom would be protected with big walls and defense and whatnot. But the farmlands were all just wide open. But now people started drawing lines and saying, "I own this piece," or putting up fences so that people couldn't get in and just sort of farm wherever they wanted. So that's the enclosure movement. The wealthy are essentially taking the land that used to be somewhat common, and they're making it their own, and they're using it to make money. And this is what's displacing peasants and rural people and forcing them to move into villages and cities. So we talked about the population explosion. I talked about it I went through most of these reasons already. Declining death rates. People were living longer because we could cure certain diseases now, or at least treat certain diseases. Fewer infants were dying. We had a better understanding of how to nurture infants, mothers were healthier, that sort of thing. So the agricultural revolution basically provided the food and the jobs for people to be healthier and for us to be able to do more scientific research and more technological research, which in turn helped improve medicine and help improve our ability to let people live longer lives. So it's all related, right? So the more food, healthier people, more people to farm and to work in factories leads to more money, which leads to better advances, which leads to better people. You can see how this just kind of keeps building on itself, and nations become wealthier and people become generally healthier and live longer and whatnot. Does it solve every problem? Of course not. But in general, this was a positive cycle. We were getting more results out of less labor, which opened up that labor for opportunities to make better products and to make better machines and to improve society's ability to take care of its people and also generate wealth. So it was a very, very, very important time, and it wasn't just happening in Britain. Obviously, good ideas spread. So this may be where our focus is right now, but ideas spread from Britain and from Western Europe to other parts of the world, and technologies and processes from other parts of the world came to the Western world as well. I mean, for instance, paper was invented, and gunpowder and fireworks, etc., were invented in China long before any of this was happening. And good ideas travel. So we have paper today, and we had paper in different lands back then because of trade. Good ideas travel. Okay, so I talked about how the labor force is required in cities because now we've got this the ability to make machines and build factories and build and refine and produce and trade goods. There's a big demand for that because nations and people want to make money. That labor tended to come from the countryside, people moving off the farm, moving into the city. Okay. There's a term here, the domestic system. This is basically just the idea that everything would be done, that entrepreneurs had developed a system that it would be, you would require assistance, or you would require imports from other countries in order to produce something or to refine something. But now, sorry, I'm kind of half reading, half talking. Let's just keep it on the technology portion. All this stuff used to be done by hand and with what you could basically produce on your own. But with the improved transportation and trade and whatnot, things weren't done by hand anymore, so hand weaving and whatnot was replaced by mechanical looms. Also, you had access to more materials, dyes, different things that you could work into your product to improve it. And it's part of what we consider textile manufacturing, and it increased the rate at which you could make textiles, rugs, carpets, fabrics, etc., with patterns on them at a rate that wasn't even possible before, not even close to possible, probably couldn't even dream of. So that became something that became a very tradable item because it could be produced relatively quickly with reasonably small resources. So factory system, long story short, because I'm kind of running out of time here. Factory system, factories are being built. Factories need power. Factories are typically, they need power. And this is before electricity, right? So they would oftentimes use a water wheel and use the water of a river, a flowing body of water to turn a wheel to generate power for whatever it is that you were building or working on. Steam came into play. Use of, basically it was all pulled together into buildings that were dedicated to a single purpose, which would have been building this or building that or turning grain into flour, a mill or something like that. So there was more an emphasis on taking distributed resources, putting them in a single place, and then bringing in workers to work all that stuff. And it was very efficient. It was something that hadn't really been explored before in cities. The iron industry became big because the ways that they refined and produced machinery and utensils and tools and whatnot using iron and steel, durable, not light, but extremely durable, lasted for a long time, and could be used because it was so strong, could be used for things that wood and other elements before couldn't, and building supplies couldn't be used for. So this was a really required part of the Industrial Revolution. We wouldn't have the machines we have and the technology and improvements we have if we didn't have materials that were strong enough and easy enough to refine and produce in order to build those things. So iron became very important. I already talked about the steam engine and transportation and the rail system. 58 kilometers an hour for the rocket in 1829. That was far faster than anybody had ever gone on anything before. Maybe a horse could have run that fast, but not for 400 miles. So now we're getting people and product to places a long way away very quickly, and all we need to do it is coal or wood to burn to run the steam engine. Okay, natural resources. Okay, you do need wood and coal to run a lot of the implements and a lot of the factories and whatnot. You can't just do it on person power alone, because all you need to power a person is food. But in order to run a steam engine, in order to run some of the more complex machinery, you need to have a lot of wood. You have to have a lot of coal. You've got to have generally things that burn. So the ability to acquire natural resources that would help with this industrial revolution became very popular. And remember, this is happening, in the sort of mid-colonial era. So a lot of things were mined and refined, not necessarily in your home country, brought home to be used in the factories and other products of the industrial era. So we're going through resources, the things we mine, the things that we refine, the woods, the coals, any mining stuff. We're going through that stuff a lot quicker now because the machines are using it. So you need a lot more of it. So that contributed in part to the importance of colonialism, but also the exploitation of resources contributed to the industrial era and the industrialization the process. Okay, it says we use water power. Now they did use water power, but sort of by the end of the original industrial era, we were talking mostly about burning coal, burning things that would burn well to produce energy, and then start moving into things like oil and refining oil into gas and whatnot. So that became the primary power generators of the time. Water largely was phased out for a long time. Human resources is just essentially, let's just think about this in the industrial era, is the people that were making the goods, the people that were working in the factories and whatnot. Because people were living longer, because people were generally healthier, there was more access to workers that could work in these places than ever before. So that's the human resource. You can't have factories without having people to run them. Okay, I see I'm out of time. I'll move on to a bit more of the capitalist era in the next session, or I might just post a little video about it, but hopefully that gives us a reasonable introduction to the industrial era and the Industrial Revolution and why it so quickly and so significantly changed the course of technology and economics in Western Europe is what we're focusing on. But all of those changes with regard to economy always filter into politics and into society in general, right? Money drives a lot of those processes. So it might have been, we might have primarily been talking about production and money, but don't forget that those things always lead to a change, significant social changes with regard to politics and viewpoint and travel and trade and things like that. All right, so I'll sign off for today, and we'll pick it up on Friday, I believe, with the kind of come and go help sessions. As always, I'm available. Please, 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 if you're struggling with something, a question or a concept, send me an email. Let me know how I can help you, or come to one of those live sessions on Friday. Thanks for coming. Thanks for listening. Take care. Hi, guys. Sorry, I got to run. I got a history 28. I don't want to ditch anybody, but I got to go.